Jada couldn't stop checking her phone, not for messages, but for the time. This was her first solo trip, her first real taste of independence, and the excitement made her pulse quicken. The night before, she had packed everything carefully: her boarding pass, ID, wallet, charger, and the items her father had helped her double-check. Her dad had been as meticulous as always, grilling her with last-minute reminders. "Call me as soon as you land. Keep your bag close. Don't talk to strangers." She'd laughed, rolling her eyes. "Dad, I've got this." But as she stood inside Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, she felt the weight of it all. For the first time in her life, there was no parent hovering, no one to remind her to zip her backpack or hold her phone with both hands. It was just her and the open sky ahead. Jada adjusted the strap of her duffel bag and weaved through the crowds of travelers. The terminal hummed with life. Families reunited, businessmen walking briskly with rolling suitcases, the distant sound of flight announcements echoing overhead. She felt grown, like she was finally stepping into a new chapter of her life. She reached the check-in kiosk and tapped through the prompts. Confirm flight, select seat, print boarding pass. It was easy, almost too easy. Her fingers moved quickly, and the screen flashed her confirmation. A one-way ticket to Seattle. It was a short trip, just a weekend visit to see her cousin. Her dad had booked the flight, as he always did for family trips. She hadn't thought much about it until now. A printed pass slid from the machine, and Jada grabbed it, turning to walk away. But then she felt it. Eyes on her. She turned her head to find a woman in her mid-40s, pale skin, short blonde hair, standing behind the counter. The woman's gaze was fixed on her, intense, almost too intense. Jada hesitated. Maybe the woman was just watching the kiosk, she thought. But as Jada slung her bag over her shoulder and made her way toward the TSA security line, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman's eyes followed her, flicking from Jada to the kiosk and back again. The security line wasn't long, and Jada ran through the mental checklist her dad had drilled into her. Shoes off, laptop out, liquids separate. A little girl in front of her tugged at her dad's sleeve. "Daddy, why do we take our shoes off?" the girl asked innocently. Jada smiled as the dad chuckled. "Because they want to make sure our feet aren't made of bombs." The girl giggled, and Jada relaxed. Everything was normal. She placed her bag in the bin, removed her hoodie, and stepped through the body scanner. The TSA officer barely glanced at her, waving her through with a casual nod. "Clear," he said, and Jada grabbed her things, laced up her sneakers, and took a deep breath. She glanced up at the gate signs. Gate B7. She had 15 minutes until boarding. As she walked toward the gate, she spotted an empty seat by the window and dropped into it, stretching her legs. Seattle. Her cousin Malik had already texted her, "We'll hit the arcade when you get here." "Bet I still beat you at Street Fighter." Jada smirked and typed back, "Bet you don't." Her stomach rumbled, reminding her that she still had time to grab something to eat before the flight. She stood up, stretched, and glanced around the terminal. And then she saw her again. The woman from check-in, standing near the counter, eyes locked on Jada. This time, her expression wasn't just curious, it was calculating. She wasn't alone anymore either. A man in a TSA uniform stood beside her. Jada's pulse quickened. She looked around the terminal. Other passengers scrolled through their phones, chatted, ate overpriced sandwiches. No one seemed to notice. Maybe it was nothing. But then, the TSA officer nodded to the woman, and the woman pointed directly at Jada. Her stomach clenched. This wasn't nothing, but she had no idea what was coming next. Trying to stay calm, Jada swallowed hard and turned back to her phone, pretending not to notice them watching her. But deep down, she knew. They were looking at her, watching her. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding, Jada thought, but that feeling in her gut told her it was more than that. "I'll stop here for now. Let me know if this part works, and I'll continue with the next section." Jada couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She tried to calm herself, telling herself she was just overthinking things. But as the TSA officer walked toward her, her pulse began to race. She'd felt this before, the way people looked at her, the way they made assumptions. It wasn't a new feeling, but it always made her stomach twist. The officer, a tall man with a stern face, stopped in front of her. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a formal tone. "I need to ask you a few questions." Jada's throat went dry, but she nodded, trying to stay calm. Okay. The woman from the check-in counter, still standing nearby, stepped closer. She stood just behind the officer, arms crossed tightly. Jada could feel her eyes burning into the side of her face. The officer glanced at Jada's boarding pass, then looked back at her. "Where are you headed today?" he asked, his voice cool, almost mechanical. "Seattle," Jada replied, keeping her voice steady. "To see my cousin." The officer nodded, his eyes still fixed on her. He didn't seem convinced. "Are you traveling alone?" he asked. "Yeah," Jada answered. "I'm going solo." The officer's gaze flicked to the woman behind him, who was still watching intently. Then the officer asked a question that caught Jada off guard. "Who booked your ticket?" Jada blinked, confused. "What do you mean? My dad did. He always books my tickets for family trips." The woman let out a small breath, almost a sigh of relief, as if she had just confirmed something. The officer's brow furrowed. "Your father booked your ticket?" he asked, looking at Jada like he was waiting for her to give a different answer. Jada frowned, trying to stay patient. "Yes, he always does. He handles all the travel stuff." The officer didn't write anything down. He simply stood there, staring at Jada. She could feel the tension in the air, the unease building inside her. "Is there a problem?" Jada asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Before the officer could respond, the woman spoke up. Her voice was tight, almost dismissive. "We just need to verify everything," she said, glancing at the officer. Jada's stomach tightened. "Verify what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The officer didn't respond immediately. He glanced at the woman and then back at Jada. The silence between them felt heavy, like they were waiting for her to slip up. The woman's lips curled into a thin smile. "We have to be cautious with certain bookings." "Certain bookings?" Jada's skin prickled as she tried to make sense of what they were saying. "What's wrong with my ticket?" "We just need to confirm that this ticket belongs to you," the officer said, his voice colder now. Jada's frustration was rising, but she tried to stay calm. "You can check my ID. It matches the name on the ticket." The officer glanced at the woman, but didn't ask for her ID. Jada's fingers tightened around her phone as the suspicion in their eyes became more obvious. "I don't understand," Jada said, her voice rising slightly. "Why are you asking me all these questions?" The officer hesitated before the woman answered for him. "Your reservation was flagged as irregular," she said almost smugly. "Irregular?" Jada's jaw tightened. "How?" "Your name didn't match the payment method on file," the woman replied. Jada blinked. "Because my dad booked it for me," she said, her voice louder now. "What's the big deal?" The officer didn't answer. Some nearby passengers had started to look over, sensing the tension. Jada exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to remain calm. "Are you saying I can't fly because my dad used his credit card?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. The woman shook her head. "We're not saying you can't fly. We just need to verify." Jada's grip on her phone tightened, and she could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her. "Then check with him," Jada snapped. The woman looked at the officer, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Without waiting for permission, Jada unlocked her phone and dialed her dad's number. It rang twice before his voice came through, calm but concerned. "Hey, Jada, you good?" he asked. "They're saying my ticket's flagged because you booked it," Jada said quickly. "Put me on speaker," her dad replied, his voice sharp now. Jada hit the speakerphone button and held the phone up. "This is James Holloway," her dad said, his voice clear and confident. "I'd like to know why my daughter's being stopped in my airport." Jada could feel the shift in the air the moment her dad spoke. His voice was strong and unwavering, and the officers seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to respond. The woman's smug expression faltered, her lips pressing together in a thin line as she stood behind the officer. Jada could see it. The authority that had been so evident in their stance now began to crack. The officer glanced down at his tablet, fingers hovering above the screen, as if waiting for something to confirm what he already knew. But whatever it was, it didn't come fast enough. Jada could feel the tension growing between them, and she held her breath, trying to stay calm. "Mr. Holloway," the officer began, his tone now hesitant, "this is just a routine check. We're verifying the details of the reservation, It was flagged due to a discrepancy in the payment method. He trailed off, clearly trying to find a way to make it sound less suspicious than it was. Jada's dad didn't miss a beat. "I know my rights, officer. I booked my daughter's flight. She's a minor traveling alone. There's nothing unusual about it." The officer nodded, though his gaze kept flicking back and forth between Jada and the woman beside him, as if unsure of how to proceed. The woman had stepped back a little, arms still crossed, but her posture had softened ever so slightly. She wasn't nearly as confident as she had been before. Jada stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. Her dad's voice was steady, but she could hear the underlying tension in it. She knew what he was capable of when he was determined to protect her, but she hated that they were even in this situation. She had done nothing wrong. She was just a teenager on her way to see her cousin. "Why are we still having this conversation?" Jada's dad continued, his voice firm. "You're questioning my daughter as if she's doing something wrong. She's flying to Seattle to visit her family, just like thousands of other minors do every day." The officer glanced at the woman again, as if waiting for her to step in, but she remained silent, her face tight with frustration. Jada could see her dad wasn't going to back down, and that gave her a sense of relief. She swallowed the lump in her throat and took a slow, steadying breath. "Do you mind if I ask why you're questioning me so closely?" Jada's dad asked. "It's not exactly standard procedure for a minor to be treated like this." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a security precaution, sir," he said. "We've had issues with certain reservations, especially those involving minors traveling alone." "Right," Jada's dad said, his tone sharp. "And you've had these issues with minors traveling alone that are booked by their parents?" "I'd love to know the specifics of that policy." The officer didn't respond right away. He glanced at the woman again, but she was silent now, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was a thick silence, like they were all waiting for someone to make the next move. Jada could see the woman's composure starting to crumble. She was no longer the confident figure she had been when they first approached Jada. Now she was just standing there, her arms crossed tightly, looking more unsure than ever. "I'm not going to let you treat my daughter like a criminal," Jada's dad said, his voice growing firmer. "She's done nothing wrong." The officer seemed to catch his breath, his hands twitching as if he were about to write something down. But before he could respond, Jada's dad spoke again, his tone unwavering. "If you continue to delay her flight, I will escalate this. And believe me, I know the right people to call." Jada felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had seen her dad in action before, dealing with tough situations and never backing down. But this time, it felt different. The fact that he was standing up for her, defending her when all she had done was buy a ticket and show up at the airport. This felt like something bigger than just a simple misunderstanding. The officer's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Jada thought he might back off completely. The woman standing next to him looked like she had lost all of her previous confidence. She didn't say anything, but Jada could see the way her eyes darted from her dad to the officer, looking for an escape from the conversation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer sighed. "All right, Miss Holloway, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. We just need to confirm the booking, and you'll be free to go." Jada's dad gave a sharp nod. "Thank you. I appreciate your understanding." As the officer turned to speak with someone on his radio, Jada's dad gave her a reassuring look. Jada wanted to smile, but her heart was still racing. She didn't want to make a scene, but this had been too much. The whole situation was ridiculous, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the only reason they were questioning her was because of how she looked. She glanced back at the woman, but this time, the woman didn't meet her eyes. Instead, she was speaking into a headset, avoiding any further confrontation. Jada felt a sense of relief wash over her as she watched the officer nod at the woman. It looked like it was finally over, but the truth lingered in her mind. The truth that her dad's intervention had been the only thing that stopped them from going further with this. Jada watched as the TSA officer stepped back, nodding to the woman behind him. He didn't say another word, but Jada could see the frustration on his face, the way his shoulders slumped in defeat. It wasn't over yet, but at least things were starting to shift in her favor. Her dad gave her a brief, reassuring glance before turning his attention back to the officer. Jada could feel the weight of the stares from the surrounding passengers, their curiosity obvious but unspoken. Some of them had already gone back to what they were doing, but a few kept their eyes on Jada and her dad, as if waiting for the next move. The woman spoke up finally, her voice tight. "We're not detaining you, Miss Holloway. We're just verifying the booking. It's a routine process." Jada's dad didn't let her finish. "Don't play that game with me," he said, his voice sharp. "You pulled my daughter out of line. You questioned her in front of everyone. This isn't routine." The woman's lips pressed together in a thin, tight line. Her eyes flicked nervously to the officer, who seemed to be waiting for her to take control of the situation. But Jada could see the cracks in her confidence. Her shoulders were tense, her hands gripping the edges of her uniform, like she was holding on to whatever authority she still had. "You flagged her reservation based on nothing but assumptions," Jada's dad continued. "And now you want to call it routine? Don't insult me." Jada could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her dad was handling this, and he was doing it in a way that made her feel proud. She had always admired how he could stand up to anyone, but this time it felt different. This time it was personal. The officer shifted on his feet, glancing at his partner but saying nothing. His eyes flicked to Jada, then back to her dad. "Sir, we're just following protocol," he said, though his voice lacked the same certainty it had earlier. "Following protocol?" Jada's dad scoffed. "What exactly are you verifying? My daughter is a minor flying to see family. She's carrying the proper ID. You've seen everything. If you're still questioning her, it's because you've made an assumption based on who she is, not anything legitimate." Jada felt her pulse quicken. Her dad's words hit home, and she couldn't ignore the truth in them. The only thing that had made her a target was her appearance. They had assumed the worst because she was young, traveling alone, and, most likely, because of how she looked. "I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal for no reason," Jada finally spoke, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and frustration. "I've done nothing wrong." Her dad looked over at her and gave a small nod, his expression softening. He had known how this moment would affect her. It was one thing to stand up for her, but it was another to watch her face the weight of what had just happened. The officer glanced at the woman beside him, waiting for her to say something, but she didn't. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "I want your names," Jada's dad said, his voice firm. "Both of you." The woman hesitated. The officer hesitated too, but Jada's dad didn't give them a chance to back out. "Now," the woman sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Officer Daniel Rhodes," she said reluctantly. "Rebecca Langley." "Good," Jada's dad replied, his voice steady. "Now, I want a full report on this incident. I want to know why my daughter was flagged and who authorized this nonsense." Officer Rhodes shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the side. Jada could see how the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't in control anymore. The woman, Langley, didn't seem sure of herself either. "You'll have the report," Rhodes said finally, his voice quiet. "It'll be processed." "That's not good enough," Jada's dad shot back. "I want this escalated. You've made a mistake, and I'm not going to let it slide. You have an hour to get that report to me. If I don't see it, I'll make sure everyone involved knows exactly what happened here today." Jada's heart pounded in her chest as the air seemed to grow heavier. She could feel the weight of the situation, the way it was escalating beyond anything she had expected. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about accountability, about making sure they understood that their actions had consequences. Langley's face had drained of color, and Officer Rhodes was looking more and more uncomfortable. He glanced at the woman, but she didn't speak. She was looking at the ground now, her earlier composure completely gone. "I'll send the report," Langley finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jada's dad didn't say anything more. He turned to her and gave her a small, reassuring smile. It was all he needed to do. He had made his point. He had shown them that they couldn't just treat his daughter, or anyone else, like this without facing the consequences. Jada's chest tightened, but she felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't over, not yet, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the last time they would think twice before treating someone like her this way. Jada took a deep breath as the officers began to back off, their stance shifting from one of authority to one of submission. She could see that they had realized they'd overstepped. but the damage was already done. The tension in the air hadn't quite lifted, and she felt the weight of the situation lingering. Her dad placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but steady. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Jada nodded, though she still felt the tightness in her chest. "I'm fine. Just tired," she said quietly, her eyes lingering on the two officers who had caused this mess. The woman, Langley, still didn't meet Jada's eyes. She stood there, her hands trembling slightly, her shoulders stiff with discomfort. Jada could see that the moment her dad had stepped in, the balance of power had shifted. It wasn't over for them, not by a long shot, but for now, the immediate crisis was averted. Her dad glanced at her one last time before turning back to the officers. "You've made a mistake today," he said coldly, "and I won't forget it." With that, he guided Jada away from the security area, leading her down the terminal toward her gate. The sound of bustling passengers filled the air, but Jada felt detached from it all. It was like she had just lived through something surreal, and now that it was over, she wasn't sure how to feel. The airport felt too big, too open now. Her footsteps echoed as she walked beside her dad, and her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had never been treated like that before, not in such a public, blatant way, and it stung. It stung more than she cared to admit. As they approached Gate B7, Jada's dad turned to her and said, "You know your mom would have handled that differently?" He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made her feel better. It was the kind of smile that reminded her of everything her mom could handle on her own, and how that had been a defining characteristic of her family. "I'm proud of you," he added, his voice low. "You kept your cool. That's not easy." Jada smiled back, but it was small. She didn't feel proud. Not yet. Maybe one day, but not today. Today, she felt like the whole system had been against her, and it had only been her dad's intervention that had made the difference. She stepped into the crowded boarding area and found a seat near the window. She sat down, placing her bag beside her, and watched as the final calls were made for her flight. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a text from her cousin Malik. "Yo, you good? You still flying or what?" Jada stared at the message for a moment before typing back, "Yeah, boarding now." She hit send and leaned back in her seat, her mind still swirling with everything that had just happened. She had expected this trip to be full of excitement, freedom, independence, and fun with her cousin. But now all she felt was exhaustion and a little bit of disbelief. As she looked out the window, she could see the planes lined up on the tarmac, their engines starting up, ready to take off. She knew the flight would be a welcome distraction, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Her sense of safety, of belonging, had been shaken. She was tired, yes, but she was also angry, confused, and determined. The gate agent called her Rao, and Jada stood up, adjusting her bag over her shoulder. As she approached the jet bridge, a man standing in the boarding lane caught her eye. He looked familiar, one of the passengers from earlier, someone who had been watching the scene unfold from a distance. He gave her a small nod. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "I saw what happened. I'm really sorry you had to go through that." Jada blinked, caught off guard by his words. "Oh, thanks," she replied, not sure how to respond. He wasn't a part of it, and yet he had seen the whole thing unfold. She felt a little bit of gratitude, but it also made her feel exposed, like the whole world had witnessed her being treated like a suspect for no reason. The man gave her a small, sympathetic smile before turning and walking down the jet bridge. Jada stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the situation wash over her. She finally made her way onto the plane, handing over her boarding pass with a nod to the gate agent. The attendant smiled and gestured for her to go ahead. Jada walked down the narrow aisle, looking for her seat, and found it near the window. She slid into her seat and placed her bag under the chair, the noise of the plane's engines starting up around her. As the flight attendant made the usual announcements, Jada leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't bother checking it. She felt like she was in a daze, just trying to process everything. The plane began to taxi, and Jada glanced out the window once more. The city below blurred into a haze, and she felt her mind start to settle. But even as the plane took off, a thought lingered in her head. This wasn't over. Her dad had been right. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure no one else would have to go through the same thing. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the system wasn't on your side. Jada looked at her phone one last time, reading her dad's text. "Call me when you land." She smiled softly, tapping out a quick response. "I will. Love you." The flight attendants passed through the aisles, and the usual hum of the cabin filled her ears. She let her head rest against the window, her thoughts still swirling. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the last time she'd have to stand up for herself. It was a lesson she wouldn't forget.